Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the newest album from Havana called All These Countless Nights. So I think I've gone on record a number of times that I don't really care for post-hardcore music. Not really my scene. The clash between screams and melodic singing can feel kind of awkward and not always complement some of the riffs. And I've also had the misfortune to see a lot of really terrible bands come out of the genre as it mutated into something far uglier in the latter half of the 2000s and early 2010s. Think crabcore, or deathcore, or crunkcore. Look, it wasn't my scene to begin with, and thus you can bet I had some extremely mixed feelings preparing myself for the English group Havana, particularly their 2009 debut that, hey, wouldn't you know, was produced by Matt O'Grady of You Me at 6, another group that I didn't really care for, and yet I would never have heard about them if it wasn't for you people on Patreon. But then something happened that I didn't expect. Their screaming vocalist Ryan Miller left the band for personal reasons after that first album, which resulted in a necessary hard pivot towards pop punk and power pop. Their sound got rootsier along the way, and what resulted was a very Jimmy Eat World-esque kind of stab at rock music, only with more interesting and intricate guitar work and tighter bass lines, which I would consider a net positive. And for once, a lot of critics agreed, throwing a fair amount of praise that way for that 2011 project Fools and Worthless Liars, which I actually happen to like a decent bit. The pivot and overwritten but earnest lyrics actually reminded me a little of Frank Turner, and in a good way. Frontman James Vecchiolotti didn't have that kind of charisma, sure, but you could definitely see him on that path, especially as a songwriter on tracks like Hun Stanton Pier, coupled with a penchant to take some borderline progressive instrumental risks. Now that third album, Old Souls, dove even more into rough-edge material, even pulling from soul and blues to augment an already strong power pop formula. I had a lot of reason to dig into All These Constant Nights and expect some real quality behind it. So, did we get that? Well, I'm of two minds about this project. On the one hand, you could easily make the argument that on a musical level, it is less interesting or compelling than their last two releases. All These Constant Nights is darker and heavier and less outwardly experimental in its choice of tones and sounds and melodies, a little bit more straightforward, and I can see some people calling it more of the same. But on the other hand, if you delve into the lyrics, this might just be one of Havana's most personal albums to date, and yet the more I thought about it, the more I'm a little unsure that it managed to push those lyrics into true greatness. In other words, I'm definitely convinced this record is on the cusp of being really damn great, but the question of whether or not it tips over into excellence, that's kind of a lot trickier. So okay, let's start off with the instrumentation and production, the place where the majority of critics thus far have come down pretty hard on Havana. And it's not like they're entirely wrong here either, because make no mistakes, this is meat and potatoes rock music, from the array of aggressive guitar tones that range from dank rattling to a fuzzier brand of muscle, to the more aggressive and complex drumming that, yes, is occasionally a tad too close to the front of the mix, but not that often. Hell, while there are some moments that are audibly synthetic, there are no way that the drums that open up pretty low weren't coming from Pro Tools, or at the very least polished to that point. But you know what? For the most part, this record embraces a solid command of rough-edged atmosphere and melodic balance that, yeah, does it a lot of credit. From well-balanced and prominent bass harmonies, to the welcome guitar solos, to even a few new wave-esque grooves on songs like Trigger in England to balance out against the borderline pop-punk side of Fever or Sing. Now, I'm not going to deny that the broader atmospherics on songs like Love, they do drag a little bit, particularly on the outro of that song, but the more spacious tones and refocus on sharper melodies and hooks reminds me a little bit more of acts like, I don't know, mid-period Poets of the Fall, albeit nowhere near as heavy. Of course, the fact that this record does play to some easier hooks can lead to some distressing melodic similarities to other songs. The verses of Happiness share almost an identical groove to Colder Weather by the Zac Brown Band, a country act. But given that the Zac Brown Band ripped themselves off for a song called Sweet Annie on an album later, and given that Happiness goes in a very different direction for that hook and tone, I'm inclined to let them off with a warning, at least here. But here's the thing, the hooks, they really are that moody and explosive, or at the very least melodically complex enough to earn the atmosphere and really stick in your brain. The multi-tracked howling of Ashes Ashes coasts off into a great piano post-chorus. The more complex bass and drum groove gives Trigger a fascinating transition into a pretty conventional but still potent hook. The softer touch of Pretty Low steps into the hazier, multi-tracked harmonies of great Poets of the Fall songs, before the roaring fuzzy soul that I really love loved the triumphant acoustic-backed roar of sing that is desperately needed near the end of this album. And you know what? Pretty much all of St. Paul, from the hollow liquidity of the guitar tones that reminds me of an 80s power ballad, to the perfect lyrical cadence, to the great drum and bass guitar-backed swell of the hook that knows just enough to balance out its melody and increasing of tempo. Now, granted, a lot of credit has to go to frontman James Hetfield, who might not have begun his career with a vocalist with a lot of dramatic range, but really has turned out surprisingly versatile, capable of downplaying moody bitterness to earnest sadness to the raw intensity that Def Havana seemed to kind of shy away from on their last two albums, and it's welcome that it's coming back here. But to get to that, we need to talk about tone and lyrics and themes. And here's the thing, even though Def Havana began in the post-hardcore that trended towards emo at that time, especially in some of the subject matter, the writing has tended to avoid the whinging that puts me off a lot of that material, mostly by a refocus on blame and responsibility in the framing. So when you hear that the band is tapping more towards introspective and sullen subject matter, I can imagine that some of you might think this band went back towards emo, except that our frontman is a fair bit smarter than that, and that's what gives All These Constant Nights its startling edge. Of course, there's a bad breakup at the root of the story, but Def Havana's framing shows a brutal frankness about the situation that places equal, if not the majority of the blame on the frontman, and for plenty of justifiable reasons, most prominently alcohol. In fact, outside of Macklemore's more understated work, or Yellow Wolf's Empty Bottles, or Jason Eady's stunning album Daylight and Dark from 2014, Def Havana get to the roots of the numb, dehumanizing nature of alcoholism in a way that's almost too close for comfort. And when you factor in a lack of solid home for both him and his girlfriend from the other side of the world, exhaustion, creative burnout, and borderline crippling self-awareness that is driven by real depression, I can imagine that this album will probably resonate for a lot of people. It's just that plain spoken. Hell, catch me at the wrong moment in the past 2 years, and I might include myself in that category. And that self-awareness doesn't just give the record a restless set of teeth, but also makes our frontman much more relatable and sympathetic as a frontman and protagonist. Not just in the plain admittance of his own mistakes, but how society just doesn't help the situation. From the records he plays on Trigger that encourages him to just stew in all of it, to the growing emptiness as he tries to force on a smile and happiness, to the lingering feeling that it's all just really his fault on Pretty Low. That's why the honest confessions that he tries to put old feelings aside on St. Paul, they actually have real resonance. Or his mingled jealousy and yet renewed conviction on Sing feels righteous. Even when faced with colleagues or friends who have succeeded and moved past him in the music industry, he's fought his own internal battle, and there's relevance and power to that, even if it's just for him. And you know, just like Green Day did on What's Her Name on American Idiot, he wonders if that relationship still lingers in her mind in the closing track, or if there's any remnant of his presence in the world in those darker times, which would be so easy to forget, but still holds something for him all the same, and that really does mean something. Now, I'm not going to say that the arc of this album, the writing is perfect, because there is a defined arc. Songs like Fever and Like a Ghost could afford to go a little bit deeper in some of their details. They start to retread territory, and England feels awkward in his contempt for both his hometown and his own whiteness, which felt like a lyrical dead end. It's probably the weakest song here. But overall, there's a real straightforward, hard-hitting core that really works with this instrumentation. Sure, maybe not as experimental as previous albums, but the frank personal detail and strong hooks ground a really solid formula in great territory. And for me, I'm thinking a light 8 out of 10, and definitely a recommendation. If you're into this brand of rock, it's definitely pretty solid. In short, Def Havana's All These Constant Nights might be a pretty bleak listen, I'm not going to deny that, but between smart, well-constructed writing, great framing, and some really solid hooks, I think I'm going to come back to this. I really dug it. Check it out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. Like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I have to admit, I'm surprised I like this album as much as I did, because I got the link to buy it in the description below, and I've got the poll up here, so you guys can tell me what you thought. I can imagine some people, they're a little bit more lukewarm on this than I am, but really, the lyrics came through really well here. I was really impressed. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get more involved in my scheduling process, I got the link to my Patreon right here. On average, 3 times a week, you guys get to vote on my schedule. There might be a little bit of surprises when I decide to change things up. And if you guys want to add albums to my schedule, on Saturdays, the higher Patreon members get to vote and add records potentially to that schedule, and that's pretty potential. If you guys want to see more details, the link is there. Beyond that, I'm thinking about changing up my set pretty soon, so we're going to see how that goes. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.